So I will talk slowly and talk about the prefrontal seizures. Just you see, this is a sculpture from China showing a very nice characteristic sign of only some of the frontal seizures you will see. You know it, I am sure. So I will not go into details about anatomy because Jorge just did that right now, but just to delineate what I will talk about today. I will talk about the prefrontal cortex, and in my case this afternoon, I will give an example of the motor and premotor cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is, you see, rostral to the premotor and motor region, as shown by Jorge. This is the motor cortex, and this is the premotor regions of area 6. And what we call we have the precentral premotor, and what we call the prefrontal cortex is this big, huge part of the frontal lobe, which is rostral to the premotor. And so we distinguish it's a part of what we call the frontal granular cortex. And you see a lot of these areas are the lateral, dorsal, and ventral, on the medial, ventral, and dorsal also, and the orbital surface, lateral and medial. The prefrontal cortex is characterized also by the projection from the mediodorsalis nucleus of the thalamus, except in the medial part here, which is a different part. It's in fact cingulate region and paralimbic regions is more connected to the anteromedial nucleus. So for a brief summary of the functional anatomy and semiology, the anatomy, it's very complex. And what we have for the purpose of epilepsy and epilepsy surgery, never forget, is the volume of the frontal cortex, which is almost 40% of the total volume of the brain. And the connectivity is also very important to consider because as it is mainly an heteromodal cortex, it has a lot of connectivity, not only with the frontal lobe, with many other parts of the cerebral cortex. I will show that. The functional significance, so just a brief summary of it, but to remind that it's specialized in executive functions. That is what we call the executive attention, also the working memory, planning of acts and goals, and globally, or what is the goal-directed behavior. It's also, some part of it are actively participating in what we call the social and emotional processing. And we must never forget that its role in declarative memory retrieval is important. And we can have many deficit of it in some post-surgical cases. The frontal seizures are known to have a so-called complex semiology. It's true. It's true, but it could be even more complex if it could access to the whole semiology, because most of it is certainly not accessible to the observer because it's cognitive and it can be impaired by the impairment of consciousness. So what we see is something that arises from the associative cortex, and so we have not to find any homunculus or homunculus-like way of localizing in this prefrontal cortex. So the localization process is very different from the sensory-motor cortices. Just to give you an idea of the connection, that means the connection will be used by the seizures in the human brain. This is a monkey brain, but if you see all the projections from the inferior part, ventral part of the lateral inferior cortex, this is the principal sulcus of the monkey. You see that a lot of projections go to the parietal lobe, inferior parietal lobule, and superior temporal cortex, the insular and the perinsular regions, and the lateral, also the lateral orbital cortex, will have a lot of connections with the temporal pole and the parahippocampal gyrus. And also there will be projection from the medial cortex to the superior temporal sulcus. Now the upper part that means dorsal to the principal sulcus, it is 946, you see that the projections are also very posterior in the posterior cingulate region, in the anterior parietal cortex, the TPO junction, and the superior temporal gyrus and the superior temporal sulcus. So just to get an idea how difficult will be the localization process and understanding the semiology. So this has been done expressed by the work of Thibaut de Schoten and Armadi. So here you have, for example, a notion of superior temporal, superior longitudinal fasciculus. This is the arcuate fasciculus. This is the frontal occipital fasciculus. This is the uncinate fasciculus, the cingulum, and the ascendant frontal ascendant fasciculus. Just to give you an idea that when you think of the frontal seizure in these regions, you must know that the seizures can propagate very remotely from the frontal cortex itself. It is important to understand that for the semiology, but also for the SEG implantations. I will start with some introductory remarks on semiology and networks for some generalities, I'm sorry, but just to show you that even if this complexity, we can extract some guidelines in order to understand more, or at least to understand enough to explore this patient with SEG. So what is frontal semiology? It's mainly what we can observe. That means it's motor semiology. We'll see how we can distinguish the integrated versus non-integrated behavior. That means integrated meaning it can be read, it can be interpreted as a whole behavior, quasi-naturalistic, like fear or grabbing objects or utilization behavior. The non-integrated behavior is just the opposite of that. That means it's, for example, the associations of tonic postural manifestations with some gestural manifestations. So that's one characters that we must differentiate from the video EEG and to categorize. The hyperkinesia versus hypokinesia, it has been a long debate in the literature that's saying that all the motor seizures are hyperkinetic, or the term hypermotor. I totally disagree with that. Maybe hyperkinetic is just a description. It doesn't mean anything about the origin of the seizures. And as the seizures in frontal lobe can be totally hypokinetic, the best example is absence seizures. You have also in the motor semiology to distinguish the axial proximal versus distal behavior. Has been can be goal-directed behavior, reaching and grasping with the hand. So the region of the body from where it is organized is important to consider. And we'll see a lot of repetitive behavior that we call stereotypy because it's the definition. That's the characteristic of motor semiology. In addition, you can have an associated with them or not autonomic and emotional signs. And obviously, a lot of cognitive semiology, very difficult to apprehend, like language disorders and impairment and modifications, mainly in the dominant side, and modification of consciousness. I will show you examples of, I cannot, sorry, I have to change my arrow. Maybe to access, okay. So I show you here a seizure. See, in a given patient, and now in the same patient, another seizure.
Tirez la langue, Carmel.
So you see there is a variation of, but it's the same. Sorry, I will now try to show you this. So this is another seizure in the same patient during ECG now. And another one. So, just to show you that by the repetition of seizure doesn't change the semiology, you have all this working into axial stereotypy with some movement of the right hand, and the face doesn't change. So even in an apparent complexity, with the repetition of seizures, you can extract an average pattern and so that we can very much describe. And also, if you look now at different patients, you can see if you compare this patient now with the same, stereotypies of the legs, with the visualization. And now with the patient I just showed you before, you see it's very similar. So you can have in common similarities of semiological patterns between patients. And this is the way when you have a good categorization and a good terminology for this categorization, is the way you can advance in the recognition of patterns in frontal lobe seizures. So also the semiological expressions can be modified by environmental factors. I show you again the same patient, but you will see that someone will intervene in the middle and modify the semiology. Also, he comes and she stops when the observer says, don't move, and she stops. And now you keep.
Voilà, ça y est, on va la 2 et 2. Ça y est, ça va, bouge pas, c'est bien. C'est bien. Voilà, c'est bien. Ça y est, te fais pas mal. Voilà, ça y est.
She keeps some contact with the observer.
Ouais, je sais, allez.
And sometimes it can be difficult to make difference between some non-epileptic seizures and frontal seizures because of this phenomenon. One of the most, sorry for it's a very old video because it was 20, 30 years ago, but I impressed my pupils with this video because I could stop, you will see, a seizure during ECG. It was like magical. So you see the patient. You see how it's agitated, and I arrived. And I stopped the seizure and arrested just in talking to the patient. How are you doing? Who are you? She doesn't reply because it's on the website. Oh, what's my name? I don't know. What is this? What's the name of this object? So you see that especially when the seizures are from the lateral part of the cortex, there is some, I would say, place in the connection from the environment to intervene in the course of the seizure. That's one of the characteristics of these frontal lobe seizures. Now, I will show you from an observations we had together with Jorge in the past when we were at the Cleveland Clinic of a seizure, how to show you how the buildup of clinical semiology in prefrontal seizures followed by ECG. This is the semiology of this patient. Nobody will intervene during the seizure, but it is expressive enough for you to understand. You will feel something first and try to press the button. Yes, that it's now. Doesn't know what's happening, but you feel something. The movement of the lips and now you're trying to grab, but cannot. And now you see there is a vocalization, a moaning, and a movement, gestural movement of the arms. He turned to the right, and he has axial stereotypies, balancing from left to right, and the legs, and now turning to try to turn to the pillow repetitively. And at the end, you see this manifestation of when we don't know if it is purposeful or not. That's the seizure. And so that was the implantation made by Jorge. In the past, you see that this patient had before a right temporal lobectomy, but he obviously was not seizure free. So when you look at when you look now at the SEG, you see that from the electrode Z, you see a permanent spiking, and it's limited except that at the top of the screen, you see that also in the electrode 1012, you have also spiking related to the same activity, but maybe it's a propagation of it. This is exactly at the cross of the two lines. It's in the very posterior and medial orbitofrontal cortex. And at the time now, you see that it's no more a spiking activity, but a fast activity in this region and also in the insular cortex now in the Y electrodes. So you see that now you have the orbitofrontal cortex, the insular cortex, and you see that now the seizure progresses and the clinical activity starts now when you have a coherent activity, that means synchronous activity, between the orbitofrontal cortex, the insula, and exactly here, that is in the medial cingulate gyrus, in the two parts of this gyrus, the insular cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex. And also at the bottom, you see A prime and Y prime. That means it's a contralateral propagation exactly at the same time. And so the seizure progress, and you see now is turning to the right. We have now the seizures will in R electrode will reach the opercular insular region as here, R and U mesial. It's in the insular cortex, exactly here. So you see now that during this complex behavior, you have a lot of different areas involved at the same time. And after the seizures will progress to other parts of the cortex, and finally with arrest almost synchronously. When we measured, for example, during the seizure, the increased coherence, that means the correlation in the theta frequency, the curve here show you that at the time of the semiology, you have an increased coherence between orbitofrontal cortex and insula, orbitofrontal cortex and anterior cingulate gyrus, insula and anterior cingulate gyrus. That is, this seizure originating from the orbitofrontal cortex, in fact, produce its semiology with an involvement, a coherent involvement, that is a synchrony between at least these three areas. Now I will show two examples of what I call non-integrated and integrated behavior. This is a seizure originating in the temporal lobe with fast spreading to the frontal lobe. I will show you. So you see now she's spreading, she's moving, moaning. Stereotypies distal and medial. In the body, you have a pulling down the face, the lips. She's continuing. Now you have a vocalization.
Lori. How are you doing? Lori?
She's kicking now, and with
Can
the
you point to
same
the window for me?
face expression of anger,
Lori, can you point to the window?
she doesn't reply. She doesn't obey simple orders.
Lori,
So this
can you
is,
tell me where you are?
well, I will stop there. This is what we call a non-integrative behavior, because you have plenty of gestural plus tectonic postural activity. You will see this Italian lady, which will do a totally different behavior. I will let you.
Maria! Bella! Tata, Bella, oui! Maria! È là! No, fammi Maria! Maria! Oui. Tirez la langue. Bella! Tire la langue, voilà. Serre la main. Là. Ok? Va bene? Et tu vois là, Maria. Là. Ok. Oui. Ananas.
So you have seen that this, I call it integrated behavior, because you cannot describe that in segments. It's a whole behavior of singing and dancing and with a happy mood. So that means it's totally, if she had not electrode in the brain, and if you could encounter her in the everyday life, you could say that it's a quasi-normal behavior. So that's the difference between what I call integrated and non-integrated. And this is, the first patient. When you see the onset is T prime and A prime in the bottom of the screen, when you see the arrow, and at the same times you have cingulate gyrus and the orbitofrontal cortex discharging, and the onset is there. And so you can see now that when she starts with the left hand grasping, humming, volume integrated, hyperkinetic, you see that the seizures is developing in the temporal and in the frontal and insular and cingulate cortex at the same time. And so as you see on the top left, you see the trajectory of the discharge from the temporal to the frontal cortex. So it's clear that you have a convergence of many of this area in the anterior temporal lobe, and as well as in the insula, to the cingulate motor area, which is named M3. Now for the second lady we were singing, the onset is in the frontopolar cortex. You see here the prectal spike, followed by a fast discharge, but not only there, but also in the premotor lateral, premotor medial cingulate. And you see now when it's developed, she coughs, touches, starts singing. And I put in parallel some illustration from fiber tracks in the monkey cortex by Pandya, showing that the projection from area 10, from where it comes, follow exactly the projection that we know from the frontopolar cortex, which is medial lateral, but also temporopolar and superior temporal gyrus. So you see that the connectivity makes sense. The frequency of the seizures are very important. And to define the semiology, you are always obliged to consider the propagations in a multiple systems. So that was the implantation for SEG can be very complex in order to avoid to implant too many electrodes. What are the frontal seizures organization patterns? We made this very schematic and work with Eileen McGonigal a long time ago, but I just take it just to show you the difference of the way we will categorize the seizures, what mean anatomically, that is lateral, precentral, premotor, but we're in the prefrontal when you have the lateral dorsal, lateral ventral, medial ventral, and medially the medial premotor, prefrontal, medial dorsal, medial ventral. And we'll see globally that depending on the different areas between the prefrontal cortex, lateral, medial, and ventral, you will see that globally we can find a definition of different patterns according to different areas. That's what the work we did years later to show that if you want to understand the frontal seizures, you don't need to, as I said, there is no homunculus. So the only way to categorize was to apply a clustering method to the areas where the discharge were recorded, and also to the different signs and symptoms we could group according to their associations. And so if here it's a caudal to restral in the frontal lobe from the motor cortex to the temporal pole, and here you see that this elementary motor sign that you can read here, which are posterior, are just correlated to this the discharging of this area. When you have more proximal movement, unnaturalistic, non-integrated, plus tonic signs, this is these seizures, you see that it's more correlated with these areas in the frontal cortex. And at least the complex, naturalistic, integrated pattern, distal movement, emotions are more correlated with the anterior area of the prefrontal cortex. And you see how it is very correlated. But the conditions to get these correlations is to group the areas, because it's never happened that the seizures come from only one area, and also to group the symptoms by the order of occurrence. And so doing that, we could obtain these subcategorizations, where here you have in red the onset, and here the possible pathways of propagations. The group 1 with more elementary motor size, with no gestural behavior. The group 2 was, the more intermediate, area 6 plus more anterior association of elementary motor sign and proximal gestural behavior. It's non-integrated, but it's non-purely motor. It's also gestural. The area 3 is the more anterior. You see area 10, like the lady I showed you, distal stereotypies, integrated apparent, no elementary motor sign in this. And here it's the fear-related behavior with no elementary motor sign. The difference on this one is more medial, and it projects to the temporal lobe and amygdala. This has been is exactly the same which has been done from our data by a nice Chinese colleague, Lian Kunren. So now we'll try to describe the different patterns according to the anatomical classification. So I repeat that this is the rostral and the caudal part, and obviously here you have the ventral and the dorsal, and here you have the lateral to the medial. And we will try to see how the seizure pattern change when you move from one region to the other in the 3 axes of the anatomy. I will start with the emotional manifestations with hyperkinesia. This has been very well observed by Hergé, the creator of Tintin in France, when he described this schedule, this time of patients, having a seizure in Egypt at this time. And it's really like an emotional manifestation with hyperkinesia. That means what we call frontal lobe seizures. So traditionally, it has been considered as being orbitofrontal. And that came from some very good observation, for example, here of Hodgman, describing a proven case of frontal orbital origin with, fearful expression, vocalizations, kicking, rolling, exactly what we saw. And he could do, and this is an electrocorticography, and he removed the anterior part and ventral part of the prefrontal cortex, and the patient was seizure-free. So that was now every so-called hyperkinetic seizure, we call it orbitofrontal. Where is the reality? I prefer to choose the term of ventromedial prefrontal seizures, ventral is here, but in fact, ventromedial is the medial part of the orbital cortex, and the medial cortex is this one, that means mainly the area 24, 25, 32, that is the cingulate and paracingulate regions with the surrounding areas. And so I will show you first this seizure when you see that you have some permanent spiking in the frontal orbital region. Yes, it's an orbital origin. And here you see that from part to part before the seizure, some fast activity in burst. And the seizure onset is here when you have an involvement of many areas. I will show you later. And now I show you the seizure of this young. J'ai peur, she said, I am afraid, I'm scared. She said to her mom, I'm scared. Mom, I'm afraid. And now, you see the face. So the onset is very abrupt, and you have this sensation of fear. She's terrified, and obviously she screams, and you have at the same time just a few movements, and that's the detail of the seizure. When you see this activity comes from the orbitofrontal cortex when you have this spike. But at the time of the clinical manifestations, the seizure is immediately here in the cingulate and pre-SMA area, medially and laterally, and in the cingulate and the precingulate, I mean area 25 and 32. So you see that it's not only orbital, or not only it's more ventromedial as a pathway of propagations. In the past, we showed this case we published within the context of many patients with prominent emotional seizures. And one of the important observations was to see that this patient had really a seizures when it was limited to the medial part of the frontal frontal cortex, the L electrode. So the electrode is here. So it's not anatomical because it's a long time ago. And it was in the anterior part of the cingulate gyrus. It was a cortical dysplasia. And you see that the seizure, sorry for the quality of the sound, she's laughing now, and the seizure will start. She's talking to her mother. See the face change. So you have seen, oh, brisk it is. And it's screaming and hyperkinesia, obviously. And this was really the first case when we saw the responsibility of the anterior part of the cingulate gyrus in this behavior. This is another patient we saw when I arrived in Marseille. You will see that. I hope it will work. Yes. You see that.
Voilà. Doucement. Ça va? Caroline.
You see the anger, the manifestation, the vocalization.
Caroline. Oui, oui. Mais oh putain! Oh putain, mes petits!
She was always repeating the same sentence.
Voilà, c'est fini. Caroline. Caroline.
And so she recovers immediately as many of these seizures. And you see that the seizure started here in fact, in front of the cingulate cortex. It was called area 32. You see this burst of activity. And after it spread to the temporal lobe, to the amygdala, the clinical onset was delayed by a few seconds, and the anatomy of this seizure was like this, with an onset in G prime, L prime, K prime, as you can see. That means the anterior part of the cingulate and the area 32, with a spread to the medial temporal lobe and the amygdala. So these seizures could be reproduced was by stimulation of this area, precisely as you can see, by stimulating. So you have seen that we could, you see the urination, it's massive, and you see that the seizure could be strictly reproduced by stimulation of this very precise area. We stimulated there. So you see that its face expression of distress and anger with cry, it's what we call an integrated behavior, because someone with in a situation of terror can express exactly the same face and body expression. Just by the way, we could operate this patient. She had a cortical dysplasia, and now she's totally seizure-free more than 20 years later. We did many studies of this type of behavior when I was in Marseille with Fabrice and Agnès Trébuchon. And just we could show that in more than 15 patients, we could find that these type of seizures were all characterized by, what we call a decorrelations, that means a desynchronization between the orbitofrontal cortex and also the medial cingulate and the amygdala. That means we interpreted this behavior as a disconnection between the control that the orbitofrontal cortex exerts in permanence onto the amygdala system. And so as these connections had been interrupted. So just I show you another case. It's exactly in the same region, in the medial ventral, but you will see that I will not show you the video, but I show you that this patient has this brief nocturnal attacks, modification of partial expressions, after he gets the reports fear of impending death. But you see that the face show more and kind of astonishments more than fear. And it's more a body expression of fear rather than the expression of terror. And in this patient, you see the discharge were much more posterior and involved in particular the PSMA and SMA, and with propagations to the lateral frontal cortex. So if about fear, what we saw in a series of patients is that there is a kind of spectrum where you can go to the motor expression of fear without feeling, to a combination of feeling of fear and body expression of fear, and to the case on the right in green, when the patient experience fear but don't move. That means they communicate their fear, but they are trembling on their bed and don't move and try not to run away. So this spectrum from the motor expression to the feeling, in fact, is when we now show the region from where the seizure not only originate but propagate in the early propagations, we saw that all the manifestations, tonic and postural, that means the body, the physical expression of fear and scared, came from this whole area. That means the cingulate sulcus, the anterior cingulate, the precingulate, and pre-SMA structures. And when we move ventrally, we have now a more expressed fear with the face. We are not the face there, and an integrated motor behavior of fear, that when the patient I showed you crying and screaming. And now you have also more ventrally, temporal pole plus anterior insular prefrontal opercular with fear, anxiety, and oral motor behavior, but not the whole body. And more posteriorly, you have the classical amygdala anterior hippocampus, the anxiety, anguish, epigastric sensations accompanying fear. So you see this spectrum from dorsally, the more motor expressions, and ventrally, the more experiential expression of fear. This is the way we can be oriented with this type of semiology. Then you see, you cannot dissociate in this behavior different elements. You have to apprehend it as a whole behavior. Now we will move to the dorsomedial prefrontal seizure. What I showed you, it was the ventral medial, now the dorsal medial, that is this region. And you will see different case, and this is one I can show you. You see immediate brisk flexion and raising of the arms, modification. Okay. You can see the same patient. You see the face, you see the chapeau de gendarme here clearly putting down. You see face flushing. And another seizure from the same patient.
Attention, attention ma tête.
You see, it's brisk. It's you have a manifestation of the face. You have a brisk raising of the arm and flexion. And in this patient was explored in Rennes by Ankanika, Arnaud Birabin, and the others. In fact, it was a very relatively local epileptogenic zone. In this region, I will show you because it's here exactly in the E electrode. That was a dysplastic cortex in this region, but you see it's more posterior that the emotional when we see more anteriorly. Now it's more in the mid-cingulate. In the sulcus, it was a dysplastic cortex, so the patient fortunately was seizure-free, and it was operated like this. And so you see that it's much more dorsal, and you can see now a few patients with the same semiology, with the same regions. You see now the eyes are just oriented vertically and to the top. It's clear in all these patients with the same seizures origin. You see now the putting down of the lips and face, what we call in French the chapeau de gendarme sign. So it's associated in these regions. And you see also the arm raising inflections. You see that it's common to all these patients. And this pattern really is arising from these posterior regions. So when I come back to my general scheme, you see that this region was missing from my original drawing, and this region is the one who is responsible for this motor behavior, totally different from the lateral cortex and the primary cortex. It's the region of the cingulate motor area, which are very tight interrelations with the insular cortex. So now we moved, I showed you the emotional manifestations, mainly fear, to be more caricatural, and I showed you that it came mainly from the medial ventral, that with the spectrum of fear on the medial aspect of the hemisphere, from dorsal to ventral. Now, the second main type of semiology in the frontal lobe, it what we call the repetitive behavior with stereotypies, integrated and non-integrated. It's the domain of the dorsolateral prefrontal seizures, and I showed you the rostral dorsolateral, and the characteristics mainly is the stereotypies. The stereotypy, the definition, is an excessive production of one type of motor act, necessarily resulting in repetition. It's an experimental psychology definition. It fits very well to the semiology of frontal lobe seizures. So the axial and proximal stereotypy first. I showed you this patient, so I will not repeat long. I showed you this patient when you started. So you remember, now it's in SEG, so you can see the charge, and she's making, and she's working with absolutely no expression of the face. So this, in fact, the seizure came from this frontal lateral cortex in the sulci of the superior frontal sulcus, mainly an intermediate frontal sulcus, with a burst of spike and a fast activity, with a propagation more posterior to the lateral premotor cortex. And when you see now the correlations with the seizure, in fact, when I have put in circle, in ellipse on the lateral by what the discharge during this behavior, what is in fact this discharge was limited to the cingulate motor area and with propagations to the lateral superior frontal sulcus regions. And you see that the clinical onset was a few seconds after the onset, and it lasted with this discharge in the CR is the cingulate region, and FD frontal dorsal is the superior frontal sulcus, and the seizure continue and start and stop just at the end of the discharge when the nurse called her. So now if we move to the mid-dorsolateral prefrontal seizures, that area 946, so in the middle, the preceding was 8-9 and the superior frontal gyrus. Now we are a little bit more ventral in the dorsolateral. You will see that we have proximal stereotypies and tonic postural sign, typically what I call the non-integrated behavior. So you see here a seizure from the scalp EEG. Morning, you see the tonic posture of the shoulder, and you see the face like he was suffering, and he's now axial stereotypies. He moves, and at the ear, he has a verbal stereotypy. He was saying, look, the plastic is fantastic. The plastic is fantastic. So it's the verbal stereotypy at the end of this. So he said, yes, I feel, yes, I had no time to put it on. So that's, and now it's a stimulation we made in this patient during the SEG, reproducing the seizures. So you see, you have axial proximal stereotypies and tonic postural side. Fabrice Bartholomé is stimulating now.
Allez, on y va. Fermez les yeux.
He counts, counting.
Oui, ça va, oui. Comment ça fait une crise? Il
You see the same modification of the, you see raising of the arm, reflections. You see the face, the same as in the
Frédéric, qu'est-ce que vous entendez? Qu'est-ce que c'est cet objet?
What is this?
Un stylo, il
A pen, he says.
Qu'est-ce que vous ressentez là?
What do you feel?
Quand même. Non, oui. Frédéric.
That's it, you see? It's he said fucking. Sorry, but so you see that is exactly the mixture, the combination of stereotypies and tonic postural sign. The tonic postural sign being early, and that's these associations with defining the non-integrated behavior and characteristic of this region. In this patient, as you can see, there is a critical spike in this region, which is in the lateral ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. In this region, you see the scheme, the electrodes involved in their lateral leads, that it's come from the ventrolateral cortex, but during the behavior, you see it spread there to all the mesial cortex of the pre-SMA and the cingulate. That means the early spread is to pre-SMA, SMA, anterior cingulate, and mid-cingulate, and this is correlated, as you see by the bar, by the clinical onset. So this is the same scheme, but the projection is to the medial cortex, but it comes from the lateral, ventrolateral prefrontal regions. Now we'll move to the ventrolateral, that is more ventral, that I was showing you before. And look at this seizure. Look at the face. See now this other face, upper and lower face, with gesticulation of the face. You see that you have stereotypy of the left arm, but the right arm is flexed and tonic. You see the predominance of the gestural behavior on the face and expression with this ipsilateral unfit movement, as usually, and the contralateral flexion of the arm. So you see on the right part of the slide, the red part is where the onset is, that in the pars triangularis of the inferior frontal gyrus, with the propagation to the lateral premotor and medial premotor cortex. And so here we published this patient with our paper on frontal lobe. You see exactly what are the different correlations between the onset with the fast activity where the epileptogenic zone is and the propagations to the lateral and the medial cortex. So now we will move more ventrally again. So you see that I follow like clockwise from mesial to lateral cortex. And now we move more ventrally. That means you are now in the ventrolateral orbital prefrontal cortex. That means the region of 4712, as you can see, and 45, and a part of lateral 10. This is characterized by distal, simple or complex stereotypies with different behavior like manipulations, utilizations, and it's typically an integrated behavior. So that's what's important to show is that we thought in the past that this could be generated. I will show you why in the lateral orbital cortex, but in fact we have also to understand more like a system, which is very well described by Elena Borra in the group of Parma of Rizzolatti in Italy, and showing that you see the extent of this lateral grasping network, which is not only in the lateral and ventral lateral frontal cortex, but is connected very well with the parietal cortex. So I will show what I call a stereotypy. I will show you that in the same patient again during a video EEG. You see it start with the legs, and now you see how he's manipulating his iPhone, and you see now it's small. It could be totally, it could totally be unapparent for any observer, but we know that it's a seizure because it corresponds to a discharge. So the nurse is now interviewing him to see what happened. He was not aware of that. What is voluntary? Yes, it's voluntary. Okay. And so now you see, continue. And so he has subtle impairment of consciousness. So he's very well oriented. So same patient, another seizure. You see now it's crabbing and moving and touching. We don't know when it is and when it starts and not, except now. Now you see it will crabbing and put the sheet in order and stop again. I show you another type of magnification another day, and now he's playing with the wires in front of him. Any object in his focus of attention must be manipulated and grabbed. And last another one. So she has him to count. And now you see, you can, in this type of behavior, you can obviously have some variability, but sometimes you try to grab to, it's a utilization behavior of whatever object is in front of him. This is a distal stereotypy. And now it's a similar, but during a CG, similar seizure in another patient, obviously. And she's playing with her mother, and now she starts and she's obliged to play with the cards, with axial stereotypies, and you see how she grabs the cards, and she's moving and looking at her mother. She's obliged to move the cards in front of her, and after it will stop at the end of the seizure now. It recovers immediately. And so the seizure was like this. It was started, you see that I will show you the anatomy, started in the orbitofrontal cortex, but the semiology started when all the areas were all the area were involved, and you can see now the gamma activity starting in the orbitofrontal cortex, and you see now that it's started, in fact, in the lateral part of the orbitofrontal cortex, not in the medial part, when you see the red spot, and with some propagations with less frequency in the medial temporal. But now, when she's manipulating the objects, the medial orbitofrontal and the medial cingulate and pre-SMA and the lateral cortex is involved. So that's the organizations. Now I will show you other type of stereotypies. You will see that this patient recorded a long time ago at exactly the same stereotypies as the one I showed you before. I will show you the CG later. Okay, so now you have understood its utilization, and that this is a kind of, I would say, historical video, historical ECG. When we stimulated the lateral part of the orbitofrontal cortex, when you see on the right of the slide, we stimulated there, we put object on the sheet in front of him, and saying, when we stimulate, you don't move, please don't move. And you will see what he's doing.
Ça va? Il passe rien, hein? Là, pour vous, le visage se modifie.
You see, try not to move, he's obliged.
Qu'est-ce que c'est que ça? Lâche, pourquoi tu as tapé? Je t'ai dit de pas y toucher. Revenez.
You see, he's obliged to grab. Obliged to grasp.
Un beau crayon, oui. Un crayon rouge, oui. Il est pâle maintenant, il était rouge et pâle. Donc qu'est-ce qui s'est passé là? T'as fait une crise là? Non.
If you have a seizure, yes, maybe.
Ils sont la crise là. C'est terminé ou c'est encore? Ah oui, j'ai pas enlevé le machine.
So you see that he had object in front of him and was obliged to grasp and to grab them and to manipulate with his hand. That is typically what we got, and that's the same patient you just showed before, not the one we stimulated, but the other at the top of the screen. You see now the seizures reproducing exactly the same behavior, and you see on the bottom that the seizures were really mainly involved here in the electrode. You see CATR and CL on the left is the fast activity with the rhythmic theta around during this manipulating behavior. So we can just see that it's all the medial cortex that was involved from an onset from the lateral ventral area of the prefrontal cortex. And now the frontal polar seizures, that was the lady who was singing I showed you, so I will not replay the seizure, but just to remember you that it was perfectly one of the best examples of an integrated behavior. And I remember you that it started from the area 10, the frontal polar onset, with a propagations to the medial cortex. I show you now with analogy with the monkey connectivity, the trajectory of this seizure. And now this is another case of complex distal stereotypy in a young boy. You can see that it's a spontaneous seizure. You will see that it starts here in polar regions, and now you just watching that. Sometimes he was singing and dancing, and now he's just playing.
Loïc, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Loïc, il touche sa jambe, il a les yeux et la tête tournée vers la droite. Loïc, voici, il est bien centré.
So she's describing the
Loïc, tu me réponds? Loïc, serre-moi la main. Serre-moi la main. Il me l'attend. Serre fort.
Okay, so now it's the seizure itself. When you see that the middle, it's the very anterior part now of the medial and lateral cortex. That means in the middle you see this, the electrode named FP and CR, medial and lateral. It's come from there when you see the fast activity. It's not the stimulation. It's after a burst of spike and wave, a very fast activity there. But during this part of the seizures, you have no semiology. You have the preaxial spiking, so the low voltage there in the medial, the frontopolar regions, medial and lateral. And after, when the seizure spread more posteriorly in the pre-SMA and in the lateral area 6 and even in the motor cortex, you see that the stereotypies appear, but it's 20 seconds after the low voltage. And so this patient was operated later successfully. And so to summarize what I tried to explain to you is this paper of Bates and Goldman-Rakic showing that you see that all this, I will try to show you with a laser pointer. Yes, okay. You see that this is the connectivity between different areas of the prefrontal cortex of the monkey and the medial premotor and cingulate regions. So you see that the projections are segregated anteriorly from the mid to the more anterior rostral singular zone in the CMA, that is cingulate motor cortex, and the SMA and the pre-SMA. And you see that these regions project differentially to the medial premotor cortex and CMA. It's exactly the same, for the seizures. That means each regional onset, as I told you, more dorsolaterally, mid-laterally, ventrolaterally here. They project differentially onto this final common pathway to generate these different type of patterns we can categorize by the proximal or distal stereotypy that generate. But the principle in this one, it comes from this lateral prefrontal cortex. The target and the motor organizations come from the medial aspects. And this is another example from Moorcraft and Pandya, etc., to show big convergence of all this area in the system, not only the prefrontal and the orbital, but also from the insula to these two regions of 24 and M324, M3 being the cingulate motor area. So, just to conclude, I just want to notice that the semioglical feature in fact follow a rostrocaudal gradient with the frontal lobe. So you have seen that this is a paper totally different from Baron Desposito on the rostrocaudal axis of the frontal lobe. That means the connectivity is made that here area 10 it connects to a lot of areas more posterior, more caudal in the frontal lobe, and you see that the organization of these different networks. But it's in normal functioning. But in our epilepsy purpose, the naturalistic behavior prevails with hierarchical order of associative areas. That means if the seizures start from anterior and project in a typical frequency range to the other area more posterior, that will generate the naturalistic behavior. But if it starts in the middle and so projects in a non-natural, non-hierarchical way, it will produce a non-integrated behavior because the general mode of organization of motor behavior is rostrocaudal. That means it comes from anterior to posterior. That's the idea. And so, again, this idea, the medial premotor and rostral cingulate, the lateral premotor areas, these three are the final common pathway of frontal lobe seizures. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry I've been a little bit long. Obviously, this work has been done not in 5 minutes, but over years with my different and brilliant co-workers from France and from the US too. And you can imagine that this precision can be reached only with the talent of my main partners in neurosurgery. I mean, Jorge González Martinez, obviously, and Jean-Régis in Marseille. Thank you so much.